Hello and good morning and good afternoon to all of you joining us today. My name is Aaron Day. I am chair of the Black Male Media Project and producer for Good Day LA at KTTV, the Fox O&O in Los Angeles. The Black Male Media Project is a program and it's a committee developed by NABJ in 2017. We exist to promote the accurate portrayal of the contributions of Black men to their communities and to support Black male journalists through professional development, networking, and mentorship. The project is comprised of journalists and public relations professionals across the country. Each year, we plan events, webinars to uplift and support Black journalists. Today, we hope to do just that. We understand many Americans, including Black journalists, are feeling a range of emotions surrounding this year's election, from stress to anger, anxiety, and frustration. We believe this project, this webinar, will help Black journalists manage those emotions during what's expected to be a very tense election season. Today's conversation will focus on how to manage emotions, not just in the field, but also in the newsroom. I want to thank Terry Collins of USA Today, Detrick Russell of Gray Television, and Larry Spruill of WSB in Atlanta for producing today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. With that said, I'd love to pass it on to CBS's Skylar Henry, who is the moderator for today's discussion. Skylar?
Hey, Aaron, good afternoon to you and good afternoon to everybody else that is out there. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to have this robust conversation with this fantastic panel that is here with us today. And we are really going to hopefully get down and roll our sleeves up and have an interesting conversation, especially as we look ahead to the general election in November and the interesting, crazy, surprising political season that we've seen thus far. But before we get into that, I'd love to introduce this fantastic panel. I see some familiar faces, some gentlemen that I have not had the pleasure to meet just yet, but I will start with Mr. Johnny Green, who is the general manager at WCBS. Johnny, how are you, sir?
Hey, Skylar, how are you?
I'm doing well. If you can, in one word, describe the emotions surrounding this election so far.
It's going to be turbulent is the word I would use. When you're on a flight, you get to a certain vantage point, there's turbulence. There's going to be turbulence here. And I think that is important for all of us as journalists to know that that's going to happen. How do you handle it? There's no right answer. I'd love to say I have all the exact answers, but I do think it's going to be turbulent. So that will be my word.
Also, we have Richard Washington here as the senior recruiter for CBS News and Stations. Richard, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great. How are you? Thanks for having me on the panel. If I would use one word to describe this upcoming election season, I would say uncertain. We have a rematch of 2020, but this is reminiscent of 2016 to me, where you have an electorate, where you have a demographic known as the double haters, where they don't care for either candidate, right? And we saw what happened then. There's tremendous apathy there, on both sides of the political aisle, and it's kind of a battle of voting or not voting. But fortunately, we work for institutions where we can help encourage that while remaining neutral. So.
Excellent. And the always busy Mr. Ernie Suggs, the race and culture reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Ernie, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
The
one word that I would use is crucial. I think that this is unlike any election we've probably had since the Civil War. This election is could fundamentally change the course of American history. So I think that, this is probably one of the most important races of the country's lifetime. So I would say that it is very crucial. That would be the adjective that I would use.
So let's pick it up from there. Just based off of what we have seen, heard, observed, and reported, especially after this extremely political week, given the State of the Union and Super Tuesday. Now it looks as if this will be the likely rematch between the former president and the current one. A lot of familiar rhetoric is already starting to take shape. But to Ernie's point, the consequences here seem as if they will have more of a substantive effect moving forward, especially as we look ahead, politically speaking. So, Ernie, I want to pick back up with you based off of what you've been seeing, hearing post Super Tuesday and looking ahead to the primary of Georgia. Do you feel as if, A, is Georgia going to continue to be this swing state that it showed itself to be in 2020 and 2022? And B, are you seeing Black voices start to amplify either positively or negatively for either candidate?
Yeah, I think that Georgia is still going to be a very critical state. As you all may know, both President Biden and former President Trump are actually here in Georgia today. So they are both here today talking to voters, trying to kind of present their message to try to swing this state over to whatever party they represent. Whether or not, and so I think that's very important. I think, when you have people like, we have a state that's represented by Marjorie Taylor Greene on one end and Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff on the other end. You can see the star power that we have here, and that also shows the diversity. And whatever way you think or lean politically, it's all right here in Georgia. So Georgia is always going to be very crucial. It's been very crucial since 2020, the 2020 election, the 2022 election when Warnock was officially finally elected full-time for a full term in the Senate. Whether or not African Americans are going to show up is always going to be a question. Georgia has always had a very active and motivated Black political base and Black political leadership to get voters out, particularly to vote for Democrats. That's very obvious. But there has been this talk about are Democrats doing enough for Black people? So do they need to go over to the Republican Party? There's a young guy who's running for Congress now, who's running for the state Senate or for the state House right now, who's very active on social media. He's a social media star. I don't know if that's going to translate into actual votes from white folks, as we all know that a lot of our Black politicians who are Republicans are often disappointed when they get down to the ballot box. So I think that there is a two-pronged thing there. You got Black Democrats who are out motivated to run and vote, but you also have Black Republicans who are out there saying that there may be something different for us out there. So I think the state still leans in the Black community 99% Democrat, but there is a movement to diversify that a bit.
Johnny, an interesting question picking up on what Ernie just said there. Politically speaking, I think now and during these stretches is where groups tend to be marginalized and put into a box so as to make everything sort of seem the Black vote, the Hispanic vote, the middle American vote, the working class vote, and those sorts of things like that. I'm curious, especially as CBS moves into a model of community-based reporting, how you and the news gathering team at WCBS shift your political coverage to report those sorts of conversations, but then also talk about it in the wider view, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. Thank you, Skylar. I would just say that for me, in my position as the leader of this news organization, it is critical that we make our own informed decisions. And I'll go back to the first part of your question. We don't, you depending on what survey you read and when you read it, local news does have some equity when it comes to being down the middle and people believing that we're down the middle and reporting. It's crucial. There is no, I encourage our journalists in the communities to really lean into reporting the issues and let people decide. Like, I don't want to be cliche here, but literally that's the only thing we can do. if we, I don't want to speak too much about the turnout and how we're going to get there. I think it is what we encourage our folks to do is tell the stories, let our viewers decide and our consumers decide where they want to lean and how we want to do that. And I think I missed the second part of your question. Say that second part again.
No, no, no. Just based off of how you all go about your coverage, right? Is it one of those, hey, we need to get out and speak to voters in, say, a Harlem, right? Where we know there's
Yes.
a significant Black community, and both Democrats and Republicans have made a point to specify the Black community in terms of the importance of their vote. The former president, obviously, making the remarks that he did in South Carolina just
Yes.
the other day.
Yep.
President Biden has time and again spoken about how if you're not Black, you're not voting for him. So, I'm just curious as to whether you all say, hey, listen, we need to get some Black folks on TV to talk about their perspective on things, politically speaking.
Got it. Got it. So the broader conversation right there is we're seen as mainstream media, whether it be CBS, ABC, NBC, we're mainstream media. So we know we have that jacket that we have to wear, right? So it's like, okay, how do we, in our day-to-day coverage, decipher through that? We go through Harlem. We have a reports assigned to Harlem and the Bronx and Brooklyn, which were traditionally, a left-leaning voter turnout. But for us, it's like, okay, let's assign somebody to Staten Island to is not a traditional left-leaning community to really get a bigger picture and then like really tell those different perspectives. New York is a state, there's no secret that traditionally as a state leans a certain way. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Left-leaning. So for us, it's got to be, but there are pockets in there that are not. And we have to like bounce it out based off how those people vote. Like, it's like, it's if we say we're in Manhattan in the Bronx and Harlem, the Harlem part of Manhattan, that's based off of research and that we know that people that watch us are there. But there are also a pocket of people in Staten Island and other places that we watch. So when we cover it, we go with that data. We start with the data and say, okay, we know that our marketers, at the end of the day, we are a business and we want people to watch us, and that's great. But we want to tell the truth to whoever's watching us. So we absolutely put those equations into place when we think about our coverage. Is it these communities that traditionally lean this way politically, or these communities that traditionally lean that way? We have to give our resources based off what we know people view us. So it's like we don't want to overcorrect in this way or that way. It's kind of how I best describe it.
Gotcha. Also want to use this time to make sure that if those of you out there have any questions for this great panel, to submit them in the Q&A portion in the Zoom. We will make some time towards the end of our conversation to be able to get these questions out to you. Again, that is the Q&A portion at the bottom of the Zoom. Make sure you take advantage of this with this great panel here. Richard, I want to ask you a question. Should management put Black male reporters on stories that involve voters, as far as whether they have far left or far right supporters, and what should that journalist's expectations be when they are sent out on those stories?
Yeah, I mean, casting is important in the newsroom. Right? We have editorial meetings multiple times a day where we try to figure out who's the best reporter for this story, right? But there are tremendous sensitivities that you have to be aware of too, right? We saw this post George Floyd, where there were demonstrations in some cities days on end, where there was tremendous fatigue amongst reporters. We see this when a reporter covers an issue that is close to them, how they may want to opt out or things of that nature. So, when we are making these decisions, we have to be cognizant of all the variables at play, right? Not just sending someone to a rally where the ideology may lean left or right, but also what does their safety look like there? What and all the other things that you have to be aware of to keep your journalists safe. Ultimately, we make these decisions when it comes to crime live shots and the need to be live or doing it in house or putting something on tape. And I think the same applies to this political season, especially since we've seen some of the manifestations of the frustration by different groups already, right? We can talk about January 6th and others dates, right, in our historical perspective. So it's our job as editorial leaders to think about the cacophony of reasons of why someone should or shouldn't be reporting on a story, as well as the bigger picture. When we think about diversity in newsrooms, oftentimes we think about racial and gender lines, but it needs to be diversity of thought, and political affiliations play a part in that, right? So your newsroom product is going to be as robust as the people both behind the scenes and on the air and the product that they're delivering. So I think we're going to see a lot more discussions that are fruitful in the coming year, leading all the way up to November and beyond. To determine, is this worth it, or what are we getting out of this, or let's take a step back and make sure that we are not only protecting the product but also protecting our people.
Got it. Ernie, as far as for you, as someone who is on quite possibly one of the more interesting beats at the AJC, especially considering there are a lot of different types of Atlanta, and then obviously around the metro, it could be a completely opposing political point of view. How do you remain unbiased, especially considering the far left and far right ideologies that may be out there? And what sort of recommendations would you have for other reporters who have such a dynamic beat, especially when going out into communities and neighborhoods that have an opposing sort of political perspective than either you or what you're more so accustomed to?
Well, I think it all goes back to all of our initial training in high school and college, that we are there to chronicle what the news is and what the facts are. And what our personal political opinions are shouldn't matter. If any of you who follow me on Twitter or Instagram know that every day I wear a different t-shirt or sweatshirt and I post it. And in my little closet, I have a pile of t-shirts that I'll never, ever wear. And these are t-shirts that have been given to me, politicians, political signs or what have you, vote for such and such or whatever, that I'll never wear. I'll never even wear them in my house, because if my house catches on fire and I got to run outside and, Johnny sends his team to shoot my house, I don't want them to see me in a Barack Obama or George Bush t-shirt. And I'm just throwing those both out there. So nobody should know what my political leanings are anyway. And all of us who are good reporters, and I know that we all fought and, NABJ kind of fought for us to be in these positions. And it's important that we remain in these positions because we remain neutral, and the public can understand and see us as people who are going to be neutral and bring them the news. So, when I'm in rural Georgia and a Trump supporter is in my face talking about how great Trump is, or if I'm in, Southwest Atlanta and Biden or Obama supporters telling me how great Obama is, they should not have any assumption that I like either one of those candidates, because we have to kind of remain neutral. So when people are in my face telling me things and, saying things and telling me what I should believe or what I should be writing, I just kind of ignore that and kind of move on and just say, okay, but what are the facts? Here are the facts. So my readers understand that these are the facts. And as Johnny said, let them make a decision based on what I'm writing that is factual, not based on what they think I think or who they think I'm leaning towards. So I don't let anything bother me in those terms. And I don't want anybody to know what my political leanings are. And I try very hard to kind of maintain that.
I have a question for both Johnny and Richard. This is actually something from one of the participants who submitted a Q&A. They asked how journalists can avoid personally political speak in the newsroom online that could potentially get them fired or cause us to lose our credibility, to go off of Ernie's perspective, but I want to ask it from two points of view. Johnny, in terms of leading a newsroom, when you have these sorts of conversations, I'm curious if there's a line between constructive and then obviously destructive. And then for Richard, as a recruiter in this position now, when paying attention to potential reporters or producers or other journalists that you may want to place, are you monitoring their posts? Say if it's at a, maybe not as extreme as say at a rally, but they have something to say about the fact that there are reproductive rights conversations happening. They have something to say about times are hard and the economy is doing what it's doing thanks Joe Biden. But Johnny, I want to start with you.
No, great question. And I think that for me, yes, I do monitor social media, what people are posting, but I think for me, this is an advice conversation, right?
Mhm.
It's like there is no win in sharing your personal political beliefs in the workplace. I have been at 9 TV stations. This is number 9. Also did CBS News Path. And particularly now with the vitriol and kind of the rhetoric that's coming through it, I think that there's no win in you oversharing your political beliefs. Whether you want to believe it, whatever side you're on, we're talking about presidential election. The last presidential election was 51, 52% for Biden, 46, 47% for Trump. So you go into a room, there is no safe space. You don't know who supports who, despite what you look like and looking at the exterior and the veneers. So people say, oh, okay. Some people assume because you're black, you're a Democrat. Let's just say to have that conversation. Some people think because you're white, you're a Republican. Not always the case. Like literally that vote came down to that minuscule of a difference. So it's like I encourage my journalists and people that I interview and we bring into this place to say that you got to be a journalist, you got to be down the middle. What you do in your own free time, it's also not your free time, by the way. So it's like with this when I came up in this business, there were times there wasn't social media, there weren't texts and emails that people can send back. What you say, whether it be email, whether it be social media, whatever space, you have to stand on that and say that's going to be on the front, for in my case, New York Times, because it absolutely will be no matter what platform you're on. So if you're not down the middle and you can't separate it, you really got to think about, is this the right thing for me? Like it's tough and it's not an exact thing. We're human beings. We have emotions and certain things that we say that are said by, national politicians and the person who want to be president absolutely impact how we feel, but we have to separate it. I can't say that enough. And I can't say that like I have an exact puzzle and maybe, Ernie or Richard can say it better than I am elocuting right now. Like I don't have an exact answer for that, but you have to separate it because ultimately it does you no good. There's no win in that. Like it has to be, this is what the story. And listen, one other thing I want to add, and it's a little bit off subject, is we get caught up in these big national races for president.
Mhm.
Pay attention to your local races and who's winning the city council and the mayor. Those are big. So I think that, and again, not from political leaning, but from our viewer and consumer, they care about that. So I think we have to really think about that as we move forward in our careers. But that's my 2 cents. So I'll decline and I'll give it to Richard there.
Really quickly before I do, I want to say that make sure that you're paying attention to who your judges are as well, because
Correct.
a lot of those folks are a lot of the people that are making those important decisions, perhaps maybe even behind the scenes. But just take some time when you're doing your reporting to see exactly who is being named to those judicial positions as well. But Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of what Johnny said, as someone who's also worked in 9 newsrooms, including some in North Carolina, and Johnny too. Look at what's going on in that gubernatorial race, right? With the GOP candidate for governor, who came out the other day and said that not only do Black folks not need reparations, a man who Donald Trump called the second coming of Martin Luther King, that's a quote. He said that not only do Black folks not need reparations, but we should be paying them back, right? We should be, or something to that effect. So local races definitely matter. But piggybacking what Johnny said, as a recruiter, as someone who does this in this official capacity now, but also was recruiting 24/7 as a news director and assistant news director in other positions, you are a journalist 24/7. You represent your company 24/7. I'm going to even be cognizant of what I say here and what I consider a safe space amongst people who look like me. But that flyer still said CBS News and Stations on it, right? So that's who I represent. So you have to be cognizant of your words in all spaces. Just like Ernie said, he's not wearing those T-shirts. Don't wear that, symbolic T-shirt, right? And that's not just for on-air people. I've seen editors be fired for their political views on Facebook. So that transcends all different positions in the newsroom, and you have to be worried. You can look at your contract, and I guarantee you it says something about the reputation of that entity for which you work, and the things that you put, the product that you put on the air, as well as the product that you're putting out on social media. All these things matter, right? And I know things are more, there's so many different platforms where we can express ourselves, from Twitter to Facebook to Instagram and TikTok and more. And I just advise everyone to be smart, especially as this political season picks up. The rhetoric is going to pick up. We know this. We're already seeing this, right? With some of the vitriol that's been spewed already at some of these rallies and more. But at the same time, I'm not encouraging anyone to espouse their personal views, but I think we saw a kind of shift in the media kind of post the election, where Trump was doing these press conferences where he was claiming that the election was stolen. No one bringing their personal views into play, but I did see on numerous media entities, when they're in a live press conference that they would normally cover wall to wall on a cable network, where we're cutting out of it and we're saying, guys, this is just not true. And we're not going to let this play one more second. That's kind of some of the power that we have as journalists. No one is saying that I'm a Democrat and I don't want to hear this anymore. That was more the foundation of what's true and what's not true. And that's something that we fight for as journalists every day.
Richard, I want to pick back up on that in just a second. But Ernie, as far as getting out into the field and doing the work, to Richard's point, do you find yourself combating certain supporters of certain candidates who may have a certain political perspective and have a bit of misinformation, a la January 6th, or some other policies that, say, the former president or other candidates or other politicians, whether it Marjorie Taylor Greene or others in the state of Georgia, have pointed out? Do you find yourself having to try to correct them in the moment? Do you sort of let them sort of go and then obviously make the editorial decision when you're doing your actual reporting to sort of fact check it as it goes? What's your strategy?
It depends on who it is and what the circumstance is. If I'm at a political rally, let's say I'm at a rally for Trump or Biden, and I'm talking to a voter, and they're telling me things that are obviously lies or obviously unproven, I'll ignore it and I'll say, well, this, and I am quick to fact check them. And if I don't need it in the story, then I just kind of disregard it. If I'm dealing with a spokesperson, or if I'm dealing with Marjorie Taylor Greene or Raphael Warnock, and they are telling me things that are untrue, I'll challenge them on it and say, well, this is what the situation is. And, we have to do that. And we will, if we have to quote someone who's telling a lie or who's telling something that's unverified, we do try to say, because, I'm different from Johnny and Richard. We do have to say in our print, this has been unverified. a court, 64 courts determine that this is unverified, what he is saying. But if we're dealing with a regular voter, I don't have time for it, to be honest. And I'm not going to waste my time arguing with someone or trying to prove someone wrong, unless we are particularly doing a story about how voters are intentionally misleading people or knowingly being misled or unknowingly being misled. Then there's a story in how those people are represented. But I'm not going to argue with anyone and still put them in my story. I don't have those constraints of having a camera and having to determine what sound bites I'm going to use, because as a print reporter, we have 20 inches to write a story. We don't have time to spend 5 inches talking to someone who's spewing nonsense, unless that nonsense plays into what the story we're trying to tell.
I want to ask a question to all three of you. Johnny, I'll start with you. What is your outlet, right? As journalists, as you all have pointed out, with the goal of trying to be as unbiased as possible, but being human, having opinions, and having perspectives on issues on one way or the other impact our daily lives. Where do you go? What do you do to sort of take that burden, if you will, off of yourself? Are you in the gym? Do you journal? Do you go out and hang out with friends? Are you knocking a few shots back? What are you doing? How are you figuring it out so that you can sort of stay sane in this industry?
I'll start, Skylar, all of the above, by the way, the gym, the shots back, all that. But what is huge is something like this right here. Like Ernie, who I never met, Richard, who I know, this are things they've said in this little bit of time, this panel, or it kind of helps with the sanity and keeping yourself, grounded and able to move forward. And I know Richard, I never met Ernie. I know who he is, but I never met him until this panel. But those things are huge, and we have to be voices to each other. I can name 30 people that I reach out to, but the rhetoric is a real thing. I live in New York City, and the rhetoric towards mainstream media, which is what many of us are in this day and age, is a real thing. Like I can tell you a story when I walk down 10th Avenue right here, walking to work from my apartment, and I had a CBS News hat. I didn't have a camera. I'm behind the scenes, thankfully for all of us. And, where people are yelling at me like, CBS News, you did this, you did that. It's like you have to be, to what Ernie kind of hit on right there. It's like you have to ignore it. You have to be bigger than that, and you have to like find your outlet, whatever that may be. For me, it's comparing notes. Like I can call Richard Washington. I know his number. I know Skylar's. I know your number. I can get with Ernie after this thing and just be able to compare those notes and just have the conversations, because the truth of this matter is this is a Black male media project. Black male, you're in the media, you already have that. Those are two things. There are two factors that people that don't know you are going to say, this is what you are, before you even open your mouth. All right. So it's like, that's a reality. So it's like, how do we do that? You have to have people that have dealt with it in their own different ways to kind of, talk it through. I do all the above. And for, I'll speak a little bit as the leader of this organization is, raise your hand if your organization say, you know what, I did politics for 3 days and I need to say, all right, I need to cover something else. I need to cover that story. That's a kicker. I invite our team of journalists, and this is WCBS New York. I can't speak for your organization, but if you don't raise your hand and say it, you know what the answer is. The answer is going to be no if you don't ask. But if you say like, hey, I really think that I've covered this, I'm burned out, I need to go here, you need to raise your hand and say that. I encourage our people to say that, and people have, and we'll say, you know what, we're going to sign you to this for a couple of days. Like you have to have that support system around you and understand that your experience will be different depending on where you live. And, Ernie lives in Georgia. that's a, that's a swing state. In New York, it's kind of going to go the way it's going to go. Like all those things are factors. So you have to really think about that as you lean your support system. Sorry, I don't want to ramble, but that was just my long answer for that.
Sure. Richard, how about you?
I'll tell you a story, a recruiting story. I was recruiting this senior producer from one of the big four, right, working on a nightly news program. This person is making north of 200K, 20% bonus, all the things, right, that you aspire to get when you're a network producer, and is trying to get back to local for an EP position that doesn't pay that much. I can tell you that. I won't mention this stuff. But I'm like, what's going on here? What's the motivation? And that person said, I don't want to go through another election cycle like I did in 2020, right? So there's tremendous fatigue, right? And it's emotional fatigue as well, right? I know what it's like being an 11 p.m. producer after the State of the Union, a debate, and more. There's some long nights, right? So just like Johnny said, nothing fills my cup more than NABJ, right? Being at that convention and being around like-minded individuals who look like you, who celebrate you, where you can learn, where you can relax and be your authentic self, which many of us try to master in a newsroom, but we have to be, what did W.B. Du Bois talk about? The consciousness of the veil, right? And knowing these things, right? When I'm presenting myself, I think nothing like that gets me more motivated to go back into a newsroom, to teach, to learn, and prime myself for what can be just kind of exhausting news cycles, not just on a political front, but more so.
And Ernie?
Yeah, I think your question, Skylar, is a great question, but I think it's, especially for Black males, is broader than just the election. I know that Johnny and Richard, before and after this election, we're going to be covering some kid getting shot and some, fires and kids, just things that are traumatic, right? So when you talk about how do we decompress, I think, from a mental health situation, one of the things that I am troubled about myself is that I am easily able to forget stuff. I am easily able to put things away, which I think is kind of, I don't know what the psychological explanation of that is, but I can easily put away a shooting or a murder, and I can easily put away this election once it's over. So I'm able to
callous, if you will.
Yeah. So I'm able to kind of move past that. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. That's something I think that you need to have another seminar about. But I think that we've all kind of we all cover things that are traumatic or stressful that need to be covered, and it's always important, like Johnny said, to ask for that break. I cover race and culture, so there was a period of time over the last 7 or 8 years where I was going from Ferguson to Charlotte to Philadelphia to write about Black men who were killed by police officers. Then I had to go to Charleston, South Carolina on that Wednesday after those 9 people were killed in that church. I was in that church looking at blood splatters on the ceiling of the roof, on the ceiling of the church, the basement of the church. So I had to say to my editors after a while, I can't do this anymore. I had to step back and take a break because this was eating at me. This is eating at my soul. It was too much. And you can't be afraid to do that. If you're afraid to do that, then they're going to keep, if I had not said anything, I would still be going to all these murders and police shootings. And if you say, hey, I've been on this campaign trail for 3 months, I need to take a week off. I need to do something else, whether it's a week off or let me cover the Dogwood Festival this week and just give me a break. But you got to ask those questions. You got to be willing to take a break and willing to step back and I don't drink, but willing to take a shot if you need to, or go to the gym. Or every night I come home, especially during baseball season, I'm from Brooklyn, New York. The first thing I do is turn on the Yankee game. And that's kind of like how I kind of shake the day off and just see what's going to happen the next day. But I am concerned about how I'm able to kind of shake this stuff off and just kind of move past it. And, I don't know, maybe I'm just become so cynical in my 30 plus years of journalist that I'm able to kind of shake it off, but I don't know what that all means.
On the opposite end of that, let's call it compartmentalization. Another part of being on the campaign trail a lot, especially for those who are working in small or medium-sized markets. A lot of those folks are MMJs. A lot of those folks are experiencing these things by themselves. And in some cases, potentially hostile / dangerous situations as well. We've talked about you maintaining your unbiased nature as far as covering said events, but what do you recommend for those who may be headed to a much more right-leaning or much more left-leaning space that isn't necessarily welcoming of you because they feel as if you are on the opposite end of the political spectrum, but just the fact that you are quote unquote fake news at all? How do you recommend approaches to A, keep your journalists safe, but B, maintain that they can get the story that has been assigned to them? Johnny, I'll ask you.
No, I saw that question in the chat, and I'll start with I grew up in Bennettsville, South Carolina, which is less than 10,000 people. So it doesn't get any smaller than that. So from my own personal perspective, which is the Myrtle Beach market, which is still a very small market. So I get it. I get that question and I appreciate it. I think it goes back to what we were saying, like, and I don't want to be cliche here. I don't want to, like, you have to raise your hand and say, this is not comfortable for me. If you don't get the answers you need from your immediate supervisor, go to the next person. And if you can't get that there, then this is where you have this networks. Particularly if you're working in a news organization, more than likely they're owned by a larger entity. So there's other people that you can go to. And that doesn't work, lean on these people on this call. I don't know anybody on here. I don't know who the participants are, but you have to say like, hey, I went to my company. I don't feel comfortable here. This is what's happening. And then maybe somebody on this call can know somebody that works for your company to really like bridge that gap, because that's the only way. You have to speak up. There is no. Let me back up. There are some ways that you can absolutely process your environment. I don't want to single out any of these organizations, but there are many organizations. If you Google tents or racist news gathering organizations, there are organizations that give you like a checklist of what you should do, what you shouldn't do, when you should leave, when you shouldn't leave. Mm-hmm. What's right, what's wrong. I don't want to single out one over the other. So that's there. But if all else fails, you do that. You go to your manager, you go to that person's managers. We have to lean on these little networks and say, all right, this person didn't do this. And let somebody be an anonymous person and say, hey, this person is in this market. This is what they're dealing with, and kind of help from a corporate perspective. That's the only way. I think you have to speak up. And there is no right way to knock on somebody's door to Ernie's point, we covered this election cycle and we know we're going to get that vitriol that comes with that. But when somebody is, convicted in your town of doing something and they're the big shot in town, you have to knock on that person's door to get a response. I don't have a right thing to say to you today. Because it's different. I know what I would say, but I don't know if that will work either. And it's like, so you have to kind of like have like different tools in your toolbox with all these experts, which people you'll meet in your career are. And when you're not comfortable, you have to say something. You have to say to your manager, your supervisor, and that person's supervisor, and you keep going up. And if you get to that point, like, nobody's listening, then you have to lean into these type of groups and let's say, okay, we'll make a phone call and do what we can do to try to help that.
I want to point out just before we get to the rest of the panelists here that we have about 14 minutes left in this discussion. So if you have any questions for our great guests here, please leave them in the Q&A portion at the bottom of the Zoom. Again, that is the Q&A portion at the bottom of the Zoom. We've got some great questions already starting to come in. But Richard, you've led newsrooms before. You're on the recruiting part of this now. How do you care for your journalists as they prepare to cover these races? And what recommendations do you have for, say, even producers who may give some pushback at times when a reporter might say in the field, "Hey, I don't feel comfortable here"? What do you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with listening to your journalists, right? Whether it's impromptu at an editorial meeting or if you create the space, right? We're going to all gather on Zoom at noon on Monday and just have a discussion or something like that, right? It's important, uh, especially during times of strife, right? Whether it's the political season, whether it's, Black employees feel like you're not listening to them after someone who looks like us is killed in Minneapolis, right? And we don't feel like the station is listening to us. I've seen conversations that are spawned from that, right? And more like, that came off of people said, you're listening to us during COVID and we're not safe here. But, when an innocent Black man gets killed, then our voices are muted. So it's no different to me than just kind of having your ear to the street in your newsroom and knowing what the concerns are. And also, you see that in every newsroom, whether it's a political rally, whether it's somebody doesn't want to go live during the 11, whether it's someone doesn't wants to do a live vote shot instead of a package. There's always going to be pushback, right? But the key is examining it with the lens of what's fair. I think you're going to see that a lot during this political season, being fair and balanced, political ideologies aside, right? It's very much, I've heard sometimes like, why are we giving this racist airtime on our news? And you can't look at it like that, right? Put those personal feelings or beliefs aside, right? Because you will get a call if you go to a Biden rally in Myrtle Beach and you don't cover the Trump rally in Myrtle Beach, right? And that goes for all the races underneath the presidential ticket, right? So we're trying to be fair and balanced, and it comes from even a vote as simple as a vote side, and you're giving 10 seconds to this candidate. I need to see 10 seconds to this candidate as well from a fair time perspective, right? So that is the guiding mantra in everything. But when it comes to safety, safety is always paramount. Just like I wouldn't have an MMJ knock on the door of the family of a murder suspect, I wouldn't have them knock on the door of a political candidate either, right? I wouldn't send them into a space where they feel uncomfortable, right? We're about to get into this season where the CBS Newspass and others are going to cover every rally that these presidential candidates do. Can that be wrapped in-house instead of sending someone into the proverbial lion's den? It's just that it takes a discussion, right? And I'd say don't be passive aggressive about it. Address it at the head. And you might not get the answers that you want on that local level, like Johnny said, but at least you're starting a conversation that can be the catalyst for change, not only at your station, but in your news organizations.
And Ernie, I'm going to remix the question just a little bit, just to include something that we had from one of our folks who sent in a question. As diversity, equity, and inclusion starts to be removed from these corporate spaces and institutions of higher learning and government and elsewhere, how do you, as a reporter, as a journalist, sort of keep that same emotional fortitude, if you will, when sent out to cover stories of that have race at its core, whether politically or otherwise? And is that something that you are mindful of, or have you built a callus there in the same way that you have with the other things that we were talking about just a couple of minutes ago?
Well, I think it's both. I think I'm mindful of it, and I've built a callus. I think it's important, obviously, as NABJ, the work we've been doing for all these many years. It's important that we're out there. It's important that Black reporters, we have several Black reporters at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who are covering the presidential race. And it's important for Black people to be doing this kind of stuff because we can add nuance to things. We can add context and nuance and tell stories within stories about how these things are playing out. So I think with with all the attacks on diversity and inclusion set aside, I think it's still very important that we're out there. It's still very important that we're telling these stories with nuance and balance and a touch of dignity and grace. But it's also very important that we do that subtly and that we continue first and foremost. And NABJ set forth that we are first and foremost a journalists. And we're Black journalists, but we're first and foremost, we have to be journalists, and we have to be fair and balanced and equal. Fair and balanced, that's a Fox term, but we have to be fair and balanced. And that's the most important thing, to come across as a person who represents a news organization that can be trusted. I think that if any of us are, if the public sees us as anything other than trusted, then we've lost the battle. We've lost the race, and we don't even need to be doing it anymore. So I think as long as we're fair, as long as we're telling these stories, as long as we're providing context, then we will be fine. Just a very quick example. We have an 8 o'clock meeting every morning to talk about the news. And at Tuesday's State of the Union address, President Biden referenced Laken Riley, the young woman who was killed by the undocumented immigrant, as Lincoln Riley. And I suggested in the story meeting, should we do like a story, not a fun story, but just do a little quick story about her name being Laken versus her name being Lincoln. And I pitched the story and said, this is why we should do it. Then someone said, well, if we do that story, then they're going to accuse us of piling on President Biden, incompetent and old and doddering old man. And that's not a good idea. So just that quick, how we were able to say, okay, to provide different viewpoints and different ways of thinking, different ways of covering things, different voices to say, okay, this is a good idea, but it may not be the right idea at this particular moment because of how this story is going to look and feel, and what is it going to say, even though we're not going into it with any kind of intention. But once we do it, there may be some kind of result out of it. So I think it's always very important to have those voices in there, and particularly us as Black men, particularly us as Black journalists, to provide those voices.
And not to mention that it probably would come off a little rough, considering one college football coach and the other is, So yeah, good point there. Last question from me before we get ready to open this back up is just some words of either encouragement or guidance, or where should we all sort of have our focus? We've got about a little less than 8 months to go before this general election. Lord knows what we will experience in this 8 months from both sides of the aisle here. Do you sort of give a pep talk to the newsroom, Johnny, before we move forward, or do you say, all right, we'll just take each rally, each primary, each peak in election season, if you will, a day or a moment at a time?
No, absolutely. I think pep talk, sure. I think absolutely you give folks a pep talk, and pep talk might not be, I'm not a cheerleader manager, but more of a like, this is what we're dealing with, and give them resources. Like, there are resources that we have, but this station in particular in our group, that we have experts in workplace kind of exhaustion that we'll bring in to say, this is happening. This is somebody to talk to that are experts in workplace exhaustion and conflict. So we'll bring those folks in that are experts much more than I am to talk to our staff. So that's number one. And just encourage people to speak up and say, I'm exhausted doing this, I'm exhausted doing that. I'm not going to have the perfect answer to everything they say at that moment, but I lean on experts at the station and outside the station that are smarter than me in certain spaces and different lanes to say, okay, this person needs a break. This person needs to be assigned to that. And we use people that literally don't work for this company to do that. That's kind of been my approach. And I've been blessed and have the opportunity to be able to provide that. They may not be the case for the organization you work for. So in that case, you got to lean on these groups and say, and even with that, that may not be enough. So we have that at WCBS, but that may not be enough for people at WCBS. So people at WCBS might need to talk to Skylar or Ernie or Richard Washington and these other great folks. I see their names here to be that. And I just encourage people to do that. I don't have all the answers. And if I can't, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that you have what you need. But I think just leaning on the big networks of people that you have.
All right, we've got about 4 minutes left. Richard, Ernie, really quickly, some final words from you two.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I think you should also kind of lean on your staff. You know, I think all of our political teams are always very able. They're our best reporters. And, you know, they kind of like tell us what they're doing, tell us what the direction they are going. So I think if we lean on them a little bit more and let them guide their coverage, let them guide their schedules and their feelings and thoughts, and I think we'll be fine with that.
Richard.
Really quickly, being a journalist, there's no greater time to be a journalist, right? I know that we've seen some erosion in the business, and there's so many more options for kids coming out of school and more. But this, like Ernie said, this is going to be a pivotal election. It's an election for the soul of the nation, and you have a front seat to history. You know, I remember where I was working and what I was doing the night President Obama was elected, right? I remember what I was doing, where I was working when the Iraq War started. I'm showing my age, when Katrina started, and the Black anchors in that newsroom said, we shouldn't be calling these folks refugees and more. So it's pivotal moments like that in my career. And this is going to be a pivotal moment in your career. You're going to remember what race you covered on election night. You're going to remember if you were, you know, counting up the electoral votes and matching them up against CBS News and more. You're going to remember all these things. So, you know, I encourage everyone to not only take care of themselves, but also recognize the duty that you have and the power that you have to be a voice during this collection for so many different marginalized groups and more on what is going to be, you know, an exhilarating election season.
No better place to end it than there. Richard, Johnny, Ernie, thank you all so very much. We appreciate that. Guys, everyone who is tuning in, thank you so much for taking a part of your Saturday to be with all of us as we had this great, robust discussion. Hopefully we'll see all of you in Chicago. Have a good one.